Hey, this is John Mark, pastor here with Cottonwood Creek, back with another opportunity just to bring a topic to you that I think many of us struggle with, and it's the idea of what seems to be, for many people, a conflict between science and faith. And I am joined here by J. Warner Wallace, friend of mine, prolific author, writer, Cold Case Christianity, forensic faith, and he's got a brand new one we're going to talk about just called Person of Interest. But I really want to talk to you about your book. A couple of years ago, you released a book called God's Crime Scene, and really you take kind of your experience as a homicide detective and really apply it to what we see in the universe. So first of all, tell everybody a little bit about yourself. Most people know your background, but tell them about your background. Then kind of what was the genesis for the book?
Well, so a lot of the things I write about are just kind of tracing my own investigation. I wasn't raised around anyone in the church. I was in Southern California. Just didn't have friends who went to church. Never got asked to go to church. Didn't really know any Christians growing up. My folks were not Christians. So I didn't have anyone in my family. And I didn't really walk into a church and consider these things seriously until I was about 35. And my wife was the one who kind of was more interested than I was. But we were together around about 18 years before either one of us became a Christian. So we really had a whole life before looking at this evidence. But for me, I just knew I work cold cases. These are just unsolved murders. And because there's no statute of limitations on a murder, these things stay open forever. Literally forever. They don't close. And so because they don't close, we can go back and reopen cases from the past. And you do get a certain skill set that you apply to eyewitness testimony, to other ways of using and assembling circumstantial evidence, all of that. And when I first examined the case for Christianity, I had a bigger obstacle that preceded the Bible, preceded Jesus, and it was that I just didn't believe there was a God. So I really needed to start at zero. Right. If you think about it, if there's no objective truth, then there's nothing objectively true about God. So if you don't believe in objective truth as opposed to just subjective truth claims, you're never going to get from A to Z. But if there's no God, then there's no Christian God. So you got to kind of build on truth, and then you got to build on God's existence. And then if God does exist, is Christianity true? I needed to go with that entire step by step as a non-believer. Also, I was just a skeptical jerk to most of my friends. And even the people I know today, we were talking downstairs earlier with all the people who are here for the reality conferences, they know me as the guy that you call to get the negative spin on it, right? In other words, what's the worst case scenario? I'm always the negative guy who's looking for the worst, because this is what serves you well as a detective. Assume the worst in people, and you will eventually catch the bad guy. But if you assume everyone's telling you the truth, well, then no one's ever going to go to jail because you just trust everybody. You have to start off being relatively distrusting to do this well. Well, that's kind of a negative approach to life, right? And that's the way I approached Christianity. I don't trust the scriptures, and I don't believe there's a God. And so I had to really kind of push myself through an investigation. And that's part of what I try to write about in my books. It's not that what drives me is just, well, this is what I had to do to get from A to Z. I needed to know, is there a good reason to believe that there's something outside of space, time, and matter that could explain everything in our universe? And that's a question that you could ask a number of different ways. So look, we use sciences and forensic sciences in making cases about events in the past. So it's not as though I'm opposed to using science. As a matter of fact, I would have said to you, as a non-believer, that was a high value for me. Right. Sciences were incredibly important, and I actually thought that there's no point in deferring to God or defaulting to God if you just aren't patient enough to allow the sciences to solve the problem. You got a question about the universe? Well, the science is eventually going to solve that for you. Just be patient. Don't just jump to God because we don't have an answer in the sciences today. We'll eventually discover it. That was my view. Right. But here's how I approached the universe for this book. If you think about it, when you're working a death scene, and you enter a room and there's a dead body, you have to ask the question, can I explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room? If I can, it's not a murder, probably. In other words, if I get in the room and I find there's a pistol by his side, but it's his pistol, and there's a note, but it's his paper, his handwriting, his fingerprints on the note, it's his pen that was used, and it's a suicide note. Or in other words, if everything in the room can be explained by staying in the room for an explanation, it's his gun, he's the only person in the room, well, then I don't need to infer that there's a murder here. This could be a suicide. There's only 4 ways to die: suicide, natural, accidental, and murder. It's probably one of the first 3 Now, if I have to use Google...
Because it can be explained with the evidence in the room.
It can be explained by staying in the room for an explanation.
Got it.
So if there's no footprints leading out of the room, and there's no reason to look outside the room for a cause for anything in the room. So, for example, if I got there, now I actually, I get there, there's a single gunshot wound. It's from a pistol lying by his side, but it's registered to him, and he usually keeps it in a safe in the room. And there's a note, but it's on paper I find elsewhere in the room, and it's a pen that I find elsewhere in the room, and it's only got his fingerprints on it. Well, now, everything that I see in the room, I can explain by a cause in the room, him.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, if it's not his pistol, it's somebody else's pistol. They tell me he's afraid of pistols. He would never own a pistol. And then I've got bloody footprints leading out of the room. Well, now clearly, the best explanation for what I'm finding in the room. What if he's shot multiple times in the back? Okay. Yeah. Now the best explanation for what's in the room is a cause outside the room. Now everything shifts to murder. And what we're basically doing here is simple intruder investigations. If you've got an intruder, things need to shift. Now, what I looked at with the universe as a new investigator of all these claims was, look, can I stay inside the room of the universe to explain everything that I find in the universe? In other words, the room of the universe is basically just the confines of space, time, matter acted on by physics and chemistry. Can I explain every feature of the room by simply staying in the room? Or is there a better explanation outside of space, time, and matter? And if that's the case, well, then I've got an intruder. So it's really a very similar approach, right? And there's 8 things that I think are in the room. You got a room that has a beginning. Got to explain that. The room appears to be fine-tuned for the appearance of carbon-based life. You've got the emergence of that life, the origin of life in that universe. You've got the appearance of design in biology once it does emerge in the universe. You've got free agency and consciousness and moral values, and you've even got evil you've got to explain. Can you explain these 8 things with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry? Now, if you can, there's no reason to defer to God, no reason to default to God. But if you can't, well, now you're outside the room. And if you're outside the room, you've got an intruder. What would that intruder look like, right? Now you can start to make a suspect description based on what you find. So what I tried to do in God's crime scene is what I did in my own journey, is I had to stop and ask the question, and here's why that became important for me. Reading through the Gospels, and the story of Jesus seems like I could check it out. It seemed like it was worth testing. You test eyewitness claims certain ways, and so I was prepared to do that. But there's a bunch of claims in the Gospels that are miraculous. He's going to walk on water, he's feeding 5,000, he's healing people, he's raising the dead, he's born of a virgin, he rises from the grave. All that stuff, I would have said, that's just utter nonsense. Because there's no way you can explain that by natural means. That presumes that the supernatural is actually reasonable, and I automatically would have rejected.
You just weren't there.
I was a philosophical naturalist. No, everything can be explained with space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. So I had to back up a second and say, well, is that true? If I back up to the cause of the universe and the nature of the universe, forget about Christianity for a minute. Can I explain everything with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry? And well, it turns out, no, the 8 most important features of the universe you can't explain by staying inside the room. So why then would I be so hesitant to embrace anything? Look, if there's a God who can create everything in the universe from nothing,
right,
then the biggest miracle in Scripture is not even in the New Testament. It's Genesis 1.
Right.
Everything from nothing. And if that happened, well, then all the other miracles in the New Testament, the small potato miracles of Jesus, are very reasonable, because you've already gotten to a point where you know you've got at least one miracle. There has to be a divine being to do this, to accomplish this, and that divine being probably could walk on water. It wouldn't probably take much.
Wouldn't take much compared to
so that's really the process that I had to go through to open up myself to even reasonably reading the Gospels to begin with. And that's why this is the second book in the series I did, because this is kind of what I did simultaneous. When I got to the miracles, and I said to Susie, yeah, there's miracles in here. To me, that's a genre problem. This is not history. There are no miracles in history accounts. That's called mythology. It's a different genre of literature. I was unwilling to accept the Gospels as history if they contain miracles. And that's when we started having this discussion about, well, I always talked about Big Bang cosmology. I was somebody who believed the universe came into existence from nothing based on the science. Well, how do I hold that position and yet still reject the miracles of the New Testament? Right. Especially if every other dimension of the accounts does check the boxes you would need to check for reliable eyewitness testimony. As a matter of fact, let's put it this way as a thought experiment. If the New Testament accounts did not have any miracles at all, Jesus is just a teaching rabbi, born in the same region, same cities, but not born of a virgin. Doesn't ever do any miracles. He develops a following. He's got wise wisdom teaching, but he never walks on water, never feeds 5,000, never performs a miracle, no healings, and certainly never rises from the grave. He just dies a simple death, and he's honored by the people who love him and continue his teaching afterwards. If that was the story, based on the manuscript evidence, I don't think there would be a single skeptic anywhere in the world who would suggest that Jesus did not exist, that these were not historically viable. He'd be the best attested ancient in the history of ancients, given the manuscript evidence we have.
Just because all the manuscript, documents,
the number of ways he's impacted the world, the number of ways that his story's been repeated throughout history, all of that stuff, even the stuff I talk about in person of interest, all that stuff would make sense, and nobody would have no one would flinch.
Right.
But there's miracles in those accounts. Therefore, they can't be true. Well, that just shows you that this hesitancy is not about the manuscript evidence. It's not about the reliability of the text. It's about a presuppositional bias against the miraculous. It's about people refusing, two things: refusing that anything miraculous can happen, and also Jesus is not just a character who existed, like other historical figures. He's a character that calls us to repentance, that calls us to something different, that puts demands on who we are. And I think one of the reasons why I'm willing to accept the claims of Jesus about myself, that the call of Jesus on my life, is because of the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, it's because he demonstrated he's something other than just another human who's got advice for this human, right? Yeah. He demonstrated that he is something other than that. And that's why I'm willing to accept what really sometimes feels like a burden,
right?
To be transformed, to have a constant renewing of my mind, right? To submit my will to the master. Who does that if it's just another guy like you?
Right.
It's because he's something more than that. But for me, I had to get to a place where I could believe that would actually happen.
And that's the beauty of what we see in this work and cold case Christianity and person of interest, as we look at and we're going to talk about, is that you took the skills and the talents and abilities you already had. You even took the skepticism that you already had, and you came to the New Testament. Then you went and looked at the universe and realized the only explanation is somebody other for the universe than someone who's in the universe. So we can't explain it because we had a beginning. But then you also looked at the New Testament evidence of the Gospels and saw the eyewitness accounts, all the documents that are there and available that really attest to Jesus' life, his message, his meaning, and everything, way more than anybody else. And you touched on it rightly so. If the miracles weren't in there, everybody would accept it because undoubtedly, Jesus is more highly documented than anybody else. Right. Now you add the miracles in, people want to reject it. But there is truth in looking at the universe drives us to the fact that the miracles that we see in the Gospels, I love the way they put it, that's little stuff compared to what we see.
Well, and this is what Scripture tells us, right? The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Okay, so we know that there is natural revelation that should at least align us to be sensitive that there's a God, right? And most young people, they've done surveys, I even talk about these in person of interest, there have been surveys that have been done on the vast majority of people in the world believe in a higher power of some sort. And we are born with that intuition, this idea that we are in a world that appears to have attributes of design that we then infer the existence of a designer to explain. That is very common in young people. Even studies that are being done in Ivy League schools with non-Christians have discovered that we're born with this innate sense that there is a God. It's kind of, they say in their studies, bred in the bone. It's part of our DNA structure. That the default position is not atheism. The default position is a form of theism. Right. And then we simply have to, the acquired position, they say according to their studies, is an atheist position. And so a lot of us give an intuitive sense, of course we're designed in the image of our Creator, that this is true. But a lot of what happens is we are prideful people. And if there was no God, it would certainly be in some ways, I think, an easier life to live. I think it's going to be harder and harder for young people especially. We're here doing a conference at your church for 2,000 high schoolers. This is awesome. But I think it's a big ask right now. And maybe it doesn't feel that way, maybe in some parts of the country as much as it does in others. Right. But I think for us to ask our kids to resist the teaching of a culture that is less and less aligned with the teaching of Jesus on everything from gender identity to marriage to the role of men and women to sexuality to all, even the sanctity of life. I mean, all of the teaching of Jesus in all of these areas is now either being rejected outright or twisted in some way to match the culture. Right. And this is just the nature of the world we're living in. It's kind of always been this way, right? But just the situation changes slightly in generation to generation. So I don't know that it's going to be easy to do this. And I think in the end, we have to prepare our young people that this is, it would be a lot easier if there was no God who had revealed himself to us divinely through Scripture, calling us to repent, calling us to bend a knee. It would be great if all we had to do was just follow our passions and follow our desires and never feel one way or the other about it. But that's not the way it is. And so we have to help our young people to understand that, hey, I would much rather be in the inconvenient truth than in the convenient lie.
That's right. Well, you touched on it. We are all, and the studies are out there, born with the sense that there's something outside of us. And it is an acquired taste for so many people to adopt atheism, because it's almost an adoption. It's not something we're born with. We almost adopt that. And the beautiful thing about God's crime scene, cold case Christianity, and person of interest, that, man, you just show over and over again the universe screams there is a God. The New Testament screams that Jesus is God's Son. Look at the miracles. Man, even outside biblical literature, your person of interest, that, even history, music, art screams Jesus is the Son of God. So as we kind of come to a conclusion, as you think about talking to people who might struggle with faith, particularly as it relates to science perhaps, what do you have one or two arguments that when you do Q&As out there that people ask you about science, you say, a lot of times they'll ask me this question, and here's the best answer for it?
Well, there's lots of. I think the questions of the future are probably always going to be some aspect of why, if there is an all-powerful, all-loving God, why does He allow evil? Right. There'll be some as we move forward. I think you're going to see more and more discussion about, well, isn't it true that Christianity is the source of so much evil? Now that's kind of emerged in the last 15 years, but I really think we're going to see it a lot going forward, because the moral teaching of culture now is really opposed to Christianity. So isn't it really Christianity this power structure that people use to oppress other groups and to advance misogyny and racism and homophobia, and you just name it all, right? This is probably the future. But one of the basic questions about, well, why would I believe? If you're in a position where you only have a few minutes to talk about why science ought to incline us to the existence of a God. Well, there was an atheist in the 21st century who was very, very well known. His name Antony Flew, and he lived into his 80s, extremely well known. He was probably one of the more revered atheists of that generation. And at the very end, as the technology related to DNA was being kind of unwrapped, and the nature of the code of DNA, you'll see that most people are flummoxed from a scientific perspective on how to explain that code. Either they'll deny its language, they'll deny it's a code, and I talk about this in the book, or they'll suggest that somehow I could get that code with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. And that burden's not on me. I know that every time I see code, I assume the existence of a coder. That's every experience we've ever had. Information always comes from intelligence. If you think there's an example of information coming from something other than intelligence, that's your burden. Show me where that is. You won't be able to find it. That's why they'll either deny its information, or they'll suggest that somehow I can get it without intelligence. Here's my analogy for this. If I walk into the same death scene, and I don't know if it's a homicide or just an accidental or a suicide or a natural, but I've got a guy laying on the floor on the wall next to where he's laying. He's got a head injury, and there is some blood spatter on the wall. Well, is that a murder? I don't know. I mean, he could have fallen accidentally. He could have had a heart attack and hit his head,
right,
and that could cause the blood spatter. He could have been attacked, causing the blood spatter. I really have no way to know for sure at this point what is the cause of that blood spatter. But if I walked in the same room, and instead of having blood spatter, which could be caused by space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry, instead of having the blood spatter, I have on the wall, in his blood, he deserved it, written on the wall. Do I have a duty to look for a murderer now?
Yeah.
I think I do, right? I think that the fact that now this is information that cannot be explained by simply space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, like the spatter could,
right.
I now need to turn a corner. The science, just my own experience tells me. So the science reveals that the DNA that guides everything, every formation of every molecular machine in our body is driven by information in our genetic code, but we still want to suggest there's not a coder.
Right.
We still want to argue that there's not an intelligent mind behind the information. Well, that's not a burden I have to bear. That's a burden that the atheist has to bear. And I just think we need to let people stew on it. This is the very thing that Anthony Flew, his last book was There Is a God. That was the name of the book. And he wrote that book because he said that the thing that changed his mind, after years of being at the forefront of academic atheism, he debated, he wrote books, was that he could not explain the code in DNA. That DNA he knew. He didn't die a Christian.
Yeah.
He just died a deist, kind of,
right.
you know. But he shifted his thinking on this because he realized that the science demonstrated the existence of a mind outside of space, time, and matter. Well, if the science will do that, that's why the world's most historic, foremost scientists, the fathers of the major disciplines in the history of science, were all theists.
They were Christians. Yeah, they were theists at least.
Christians,
yeah, theist Christians. Yeah, and they believed there was God.
Right.
That's
and
right.
they wrote about Jesus.
Yeah.
You can reconstruct more about Jesus from the science fathers than you can from the church fathers. That's an amazing truth.
That's an amazing statement. You just make that statement
true.
again.
So I went back through all the church fathers, and I said, well, look at their statements and their works and their letters to one another, and let's reconstruct some data about Jesus from the letters of the church fathers. Well, the science fathers, all the way from this basic things like chemistry and biology, all the way to quantum mechanics, these are Christians. More Nobel Science Prize winners are Christians than all the other groups combined. So if you look at their letters to each other, letters to their wives, even books they wrote in which they express their devotion to Jesus, you can reconstruct the details of the Jesus story in more depth, in detail, without any question, from the science fathers than you can from the church fathers. It's not even close.
That's crazy.
And that just goes to show you that every detail of the Jesus story cannot be erased, even if you were to destroy every New Testament and every New Testament manuscript. You can still recover and reconstruct the story of Jesus from the history of art, history of music, history of literature, history of education, history of science, and from the non-Christian world religions who have stolen something of Jesus for their own systems. So that's how much impact Jesus has had. And that's what you would expect, right? If he's who he said he was, you would expect that a lot of dominoes on these different domino runs would be tipped over by just the single appearance of Jesus. And as it turns out, no other historical figure has had the kind of impact that Jesus has had on art, music, literature, science, education, and world religions. No one has had that kind of impact like Jesus has. Given who he was and where he was born and his upbringing and why it's this guy, the guy who turns over every domino. It's because he's who he said he was. And that's what you'd expect if he was, in fact, God.
Man, what an incredible thought. So here's the question. Here's the thought. If you ever wonder, does faith reject science? It's just not true. You just heard J. Warner Wallace, and I would encourage you, if you haven't got it, get you a copy of God's Crime Scene. Man, as he just walks through kind of his own experiences pursuing, is there something outside the room, the universe, that created it all? And the answers you're going to find right here. Take care. God bless. Hopefully this is an encouragement to you. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.